It's impossible to understand how good Michael Jordan was if you've never watched a video of him playing. You can't comprehend the commanding stage presence of Taylor Swift if you've never sat in the crowd. You can't appreciate the world-shaking message of Jesus if you've never studied his most audacious sermon. In one brief message, projected to a great multitude of people gathered on a mountainside. His words that day were so surprising and so powerful, they altered the trajectory of human history. If we believe Jesus was inviting people into the best life possible, it's worth an in-depth look into the life he invited us to live.
It's not often that something changes the world, but it does happen. My wife, Emily, has been a nurse for about 12 years now. And before that, she had a Bachelor of Arts degree in something else. She decided to become a nurse. And so there was a 2-year advanced program that she could be a part of that crammed a whole lot of medical school into just 24 months. And so she jumped into that program to be a part of that. And I think a lot of times we talk about how grueling medical school of any kind can be for the person who is going through it, and I think that's probably fair. What I don't think we talk about enough is how grueling it can be for the spouse of the person who's in the medical school, and I just think we should talk about that a little bit this morning. So there was a period of time, about 2 years, where lots of mornings I would have to get up and Emily would take a shower, and while she was showering, I would sit in an empty bathtub out of one bloodshot eye, reading names of drugs as best I could to her so she could say what they were and what they meant, right? And so I remember not being able to even pronounce them. Like acetaminophen was one of the drugs. And I was like, acetaminophen, I don't know how to say it. She says acetaminophen. And I was like, what is that? She's like, it's like Tylenol. I was like, why doesn't it say Tylenol? Like, I can say Tylenol, right? And so I remember going through that process. And I remember also like she would learn things then medically that were just fascinating to me. And one of the things that she learned about over the course of her schooling was simply the idea of we now have the ability, and we didn't used to, right? We now have the ability to knock someone out so that they can have surgery done, anesthesia. Like this was a major breakthrough. And it wasn't a major breakthrough until about the 19th century, which means that every surgery that happened up until that point did not have the benefit of anesthesia. And one of the things that we learned was that surgeries before anesthesia were traumatic. You were awake for the whole thing. Surgery floors in hospitals up until that point were usually on the top floor of the hospital, often with vaulted ceilings, so that the rest of the patients in the hospital didn't have to listen to the screaming and the shouting and the groaning that happened during surgery. There would be between 4 and 8 large men who would just hold the patient down while the doctor operated on the patient because you were awake for the whole thing to feel yourself, like your skin, your flesh, your bone being cut through, the vibration of that being done to you. And I know this is what you wanted to talk about this morning, so I just thought we'd start right out with it. Can you imagine being a doctor, a surgeon, in all of your professional life for years or perhaps decades has involved you doing the best you can to learn how to do these procedures as quickly as possible so that you can cause your patient who you are trying to help as little harm as possible. And you have to, every time you've gone to operate on somebody, it has been a grueling experience with their shouts and yells and profanity and spittle and lots of large men holding them down and you just having to fight with the patient to do the thing that you know is best with them. And then one day you get to administer anesthesia and you actually see them fall asleep. And instead of the shouts and the yell, it's just quiet. Can you imagine the difference that would be? It's not often that something changes the world, but it does happen. Jesus stood on a mountainside and he proclaimed a fairly brief message. And with the contents of that message, the world tilted on its axis. Culture over the coming years, decades, centuries would be dramatically transformed because of the words he spoke that day. Last week, we did an introduction to his Sermon on the Mount, the best sermon ever. And we just talked about the genius of Jesus. This week, we're going to jump into the sermon itself. We're going to look at a tiny portion at the very beginning of it called the Beatitudes. Now, fair warning, a few years ago, I was going to do an entire 6-part series on the Sermon on the Mount, And as I jumped into the Beatitudes, I ended up doing a 6-part series on just the Beatitudes. So we'll be here till about 4 p.m. today. I'm sorry about that. No, we'll go quickly. It's fine. I've learned my lesson. But there is such a richness and a depth to these Beatitudes, and it may not be obvious as we start to read through it, but it'll come out the more we talk about it. And honestly, I told my wife last night, I was walking in today with a bit of trepidation because I knew that I'm not going to be able to do justice to how amazing this was then, and frankly, how amazing it is now. So what I'm going to do is without commentary, we're just going to read through them real fast because they're very brief, and then we're going to walk through why they mattered so much then and what they actually mean for us now. So here are the Beatitudes, starting in Matthew chapter 5 and verse number 1. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and he sat down. And his disciples came to him and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Now, just as a starting place, this may not seem like a majorly in-depth kind of shift. So where I want to start is with the social situation of Jesus in the first century, because we're going to see quite a bit of parallels between our own. Even though it was very different, we'll see that there's a parallel of values. So we're just going to talk about the 9 different social stratas within Jesus' day, like in the Roman Empire, what they would have been familiar with. In a largely agricultural society, this is kind of the breakdown. First of all, you had the ruler. This was in Rome, right? This is Caesar Augustus in particular at this point in time. This is, though, in societies like this is the king or the queen. And this king or queen typically controlled or had access to 25 to 50% of the gross national product. So they 25 to 50% of all the money, of all the goods and services that were rendered, of all of it, they could control it, or they owned it, basically, which seems unfair because it is. But the other reason, the kind of like light, so that's the shadow side of it. The kind of light side of it is, interestingly enough, in a system like this, you know who the ruler is, and you know that you're not it. And you also know that you're never going to be the ruler. That's just not the way it works. And so there are these different stratas, but the one plus side of this, because there's lots of downside to it, but the one plus side of it is you know your place in life, and that's going to be your place. There's a stability to it. No one was watching TikTok videos of Caesar Augustus wondering why he had all the wealth and they didn't, right? They weren't like, man, if I could just like grind a little harder, if I could grit it out, if I was a little bit harder working, if I was a little bit smarter, if I was a little more talented, then I could be the Caesar. Like, no, that's not how that worked. There was a stability. You were in your place in your life, and that's where you were. So there wasn't all this like jealousy or guilt or shame for not making something of yourself, because wherever you were born, that's where you were. All right? So it's not a lot to be happy about, but it was one thing that was maybe beneficial from just like a mental health perspective. So you have the ruler who's in charge of, it's the one person. Then you have the governing authorities which help the ruler rule, right? These are the governors. These are the bureaucrats. These are the people who are essentially that next level of government. And together, the ruler and the governing authorities made up probably 1% of the population. This is not a lot of people. Underneath that are the retainers. These are the military, the teachers, the people who kind of support the governing class. After them was the merchants. This was actually less than 5% of the population. There weren't a lot of these merchants. Like today, right, within the middle class or upper middle class, you'll find all kinds of merchants, entrepreneurs, people who sell goods and services. In an agricultural society, this is a very thin layer within the total, so there weren't very many of these. Then you had the priests. And these are, we may think of Judaism because Jesus was a Jew, so there were certainly Jewish priests. But there were also priests and religious officials within all of the religions that were represented in Rome, including the emperor cult or the different goddesses and gods that were worshipped at that time. Priests usually owned some type of land, and the priests, along with the merchants, retainers, governors, and rulers, these 5 categories made up the ruling class, but not a lot of the population. Then you had the peasants. And there were 4 different peasants categories. Okay, so first of all, there were the farmers. The farmers in an agricultural society were incredibly important, but they also didn't have a lot of money. In fact, most of the farmers in Jesus' day were probably tenant farmers. These were people who didn't actually own the land that they were farming on. And so they would have to pay, right, rent for the land, and oftentimes they would have to rent their equipment as well because they weren't wealthy enough to buy it. And so by the time they paid for the land and the equipment, they were usually had sunk about 2/3 of their profits back into what they had. And with the last third, they still had to purchase animals. They had to pay for their room and board for their house and for their children. So these people were very important for society, but didn't have very much wealth. The next group are the artisans. These were people like carpenters and stonemasons, people that were required, like Rome contracted them, hired a lot of them, but they didn't make a ton of money, and they were considered part of the peasant class. Next were the people who were considered unclean. These would be people who potentially were sick, like the lepers. Or within the Jewish custom and tradition, it would be even a woman who had a period of blood, right? That was considered unclean as well. This was a part of society that people didn't want to have much to do with, at least until they cleaned themselves up. And then finally, there were the expendable. These were the people who were the absolute dregs of society in the minds of all of the people who lived within the Roman Empire. These are the people who were unemployed and often unemployable. These were blind people, beggars. Sometimes lepers would fall into this category or possibly the unclean category, depending on who you talk to. But these people were definitely looked down upon by everybody else, right? So they weren't just peasants; they were the lowest of the lows. They were by many people they just had a great distaste for them. They were expendable. Now, within all of these 9 classes, about 75% of the total wealth went to the top 1% of the empire, the ruler and the governing authorities. But if you just look at how much of the population is in each of these categories, then the peasant class has about 80% of society. So 80% of society makes up the peasant class, which means when Jesus was sitting on the top of this mountain, looking down and teaching the people who were gathered there, almost everybody in attendance would have been a part of the peasant class, the people who don't have much, the people who are looked down upon by the upper class of society. And the question that Jesus is essentially asking as he's teaching is simply, who has the good life, right? Who has the good life? Is it the rulers in authority? Is it the people that have the wealth, the beauty, the power, the religion? Like they have all of those levers at their disposal. Are those the people who have it all and the rest of you just miss out on the good life? It's a question that Jesus was asking then. It's a question we're still wrestling with now. As a famous philosopher once asked, did you ever think that maybe there was more to life than just being really, really, really ridiculously good looking? It's a great question. And as that question is being asked really by all of the people and as it's being implied by Jesus, Jesus starts off this best sermon ever with a list of blessings. There's going to be some commands later on in the sermon, but that's not where he starts. In fact, these beatitudes, Jesus isn't commanding. He starts off with blessing. In fact, this mirrors, by the way, the 10 Commandments when they're given to the people. It starts off with like God saying he's going to bless them and honor them if they will honor him. Like that's the beginning place. And the start for the command is always the blessing. In this section of Scripture, Jesus isn't commanding, Jesus is announcing. Lots of people have read the Beatitudes and thought like, oh man, if I need to be poor in spirit, if I need to be meek, if I need to be like, that doesn't describe me. If that's what it means to be a Christian, I got to walk away from this thing or I could never live up. I just want us to know right here at the beginning, this is very, very important. These Beatitudes are not ways that Jesus is asking you to be. He's simply saying, if you find that you are one of these ways, you are blessed. You are blessed. Jesus isn't commanding, Jesus is announcing. About 4 years ago, my wife and I decided to move from Pennsylvania to California. We were told it was sunny here. Turns out that's been a total lie the last week or two, but that's what we were told. We told our son Jack, who was 6 years old at the time, the last week we were there, we thought he needed to know that it was his last week to kind of say goodbye to his friends. But we didn't want him to tell everybody that we were moving yet because we hadn't fully announced it to everybody that needed to be announced, so we hadn't had all the conversation we needed to have. And then it was also the week that Jack was going to kind of a version of Vacation Bible School where kids come in the evenings and they learn about Jesus and they play games together and they make crafts and they talk about what it looks like to follow after God. So we told him like on a Tuesday, then he went and we were just like, enjoy your friends tonight. It's going to be fun moving. It's going to be a great time, but we won't see these people very often going forward, and so really enjoy this time together and tell everybody hi. Okay, so he goes to VBS that night. After it's over, I go to pick him up, and his leader comes to me, and they say, hey, is everything okay in your house? And I said, yes, why? They said, well, Jack said he had a very sad family secret, but he wasn't allowed to talk about it. Nope, it's not the way that was supposed to come out. So when we told Jack we were moving, though, it wasn't a command to move, right? Like, that was going to happen. He didn't have to do anything to have it happen, and he didn't get a vote. Now that he's 10, still does not get a vote, okay? It wasn't a command. It was an announcement. This is already the way that things are, and we are letting you know. These beatitudes, they're not a commandment. They are an announcement. Jesus is saying, for those of you who find yourself in this place, you are blessed. Now, let's talk about the word blessed real quickly. Because in some modern translators have struggled to translate these beatitudes because they are so counterintuitive. And so sometimes people have translated blessed as happy, but happy seems too trite. And blessed seems almost too like supernatural or mysterious, right? So I think another way of thinking about it is thinking that, like, for those of you who are poor in spirit, for instance, the very first beatitude, there are blessings poured out on you. You are blessed on. God is putting blessing on you. Blessing, in other words, is a pronouncement, right? It's Jesus saying, if you find yourself in these situations, I am with you. I am on your side. Which is a really big deal in a society that believed that God was on the side of those who were successful, wealthy, powerful, part of the religious system. Like, it was a sign for many Romans and many Jews, it was a sign of God's favor if you were wealthy or powerful or part of the religious system. You must have done something right, or your family must have done something right for you to merit God's blessing in this way. And that's why people thought, oh, those are the people with the good life. And this is Jesus standing on a mountain in front of a bunch of mishaps, a bunch of peasants who were rejected from society. They were seen as the lower rungs. And Jesus announces to them, you are blessed. I am with you. I am on your side. God is with you. God is on your side. This was a really big deal because these people hadn't heard anything like this before. So we're going to quickly just walk through each of the pronouncements that Jesus makes and talk about why it mattered then and why it matters now. Matthew chapter 5, starting with verse number 4. Blessed are the poor in spirit, he says, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The poor in spirit, these are the ones who feel like they have no spiritual worth at all. The poor in spirit are the ones that often feel far from God, or they feel like something in their past or something in their present or something they perceive to be in their future would prevent them from being part of the kingdom of God. Jesus is essentially saying, blessed are the spiritual zeros, the misfits, the outcasts, the ones for whom the religious systems don't seem to work for. You don't know it, you don't realize it, but you are blessed. God is with you. God is on your side. And yours is the kingdom of heaven. If you want it, it's yours. Now, the kingdom of heaven, just briefly, is not talking about some place that we eject from earth to go to that exists in some kind of, ethereal never realm that we just kind of like pop out to, right? It is not the case in the New Testament that some glad morning when this life is over, I'll fly away, oh glory, from this place to somewhere else. In fact, what we learn in the New Testament is that what God is doing is renewing and restoring and reconciling all things, and God is starting here. This earth is going to be renewed, restored, and reconciled. And it starts with the Jesus movement. It includes everybody who chooses to be a part of his church. And that in the end, when Jesus returns, this place gets remade and renewed and reconciled in a fuller way than it is even now. And what Jesus is saying is that the kingdom of heaven doesn't just start at some future time period when the whole earth is made new. The kingdom of heaven gets brought into the present realm now. It's why he prays when he teaches his disciples to pray, right? Heavenly Father, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Heaven is simply where God rules and reigns. And wherever God rules and reigns, you will find heaven. The kingdom of heaven is where God is in charge. And therefore, the church is supposed to put God in charge of every place that it goes. We are supposed to be a foresign, a foretaste of what is to come everywhere we go. And what Jesus is saying is like, for those of you who are poor in spirit, for those of you who are spiritual zeros, yours is the kingdom of heaven. It doesn't start after you die. Wherever the rule of God reigns now, your kingdom is there also. For everybody, then and now, who feels like a spiritual zero, like God can't possibly want you, clean you up, have anything to do with you. The kingdom of heaven belongs to you if you want it. God is on your side. He is with you. For those of you who struggle and you keep going back to the same websites over and over again, and you know it's not good for your soul, and you know it's not good for the souls of the ones who made it, God is with you. For those of you who have had an affair on your spouse, and you live with that regret, that remorse, maybe you're in the midst of it right now, the kingdom of heaven is for you. For every woman who's made the difficult decision to have an abortion and has struggled with that decision or the circumstances around it and known that it didn't fully cast life in the Godward way that it should have been, God is on your side. He is with you. For every person that feels expendable, pushed away, cast out, unwanted, God is with you. For those who are poor in spirit, for those who feel like they can't possibly be a part of this, the kingdom of heaven is yours if you want it. Now, for those of you who feel like, well, I've been gutting this out, man. I've been trying to follow Jesus with all my heart. I've tried so much. It doesn't seem fair for those who haven't really tried yet or who are far from God or who are distant to receive that kind of mercy and grace. Like, that doesn't seem fair. And if that's the way that this strikes you, then you need to know that you are rich in spirit, and this announcement isn't for you. It's not for you. It's for those who are poor in spirit. Also, those who are rich in spirit today may be poor in spirit tomorrow. The thing that's not for you right now may be for you 12 months from now. For those of you who are poor in spirit, who long for the kingdom of heaven, the announcement of Jesus is, it's yours. Blessed. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I am not clicking to the next one. Can we click over? Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Those who mourn. Now again, this is an announcement. It's not a call to go do something, okay? So if you're not currently in mourning, this is not an invitation for you to go watch Schindler's List or Requiem for a Dream or Marley and Me or Old Yeller, okay? That's not what this is asking you to do. It's not telling you to become one who is mourning. It's a reality that if you're not mourning now, you will be. There will come a day when you will also mourn. And when you find yourself in mourning, when you find yourself in darkness, you will be comforted. Maybe things are going well, but at some point, she had a miscarriage. He got cancer. Your children stopped talking to you. You got fired from the job you loved right before it was time to retire. At some point, the professor wasn't fair in their grading. The girlfriend or boyfriend broke up with you. You did not see it coming. For those who find themselves mourning, we need to know that they will be comforted. The announcement of Jesus is that God is with you, that God is on your side. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. For those of you who are meek, you probably know that you are meek. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands. You're the one in the meeting that may have good ideas, but you're not the first to speak up. In fact, you may not speak up at all. It's a personality thing. And a lot of times, maybe even if you're walking down the street and someone else comes like charging like a bull in a china shop, you're the kind of person that just kind of steps aside and let them go where they want to. And most of the time, you're fairly okay with that. If you're meek, you're usually probably a thoughtful person, actually. But also a lot of people who are meek, if they're honest with themselves, they often don't think of themselves this way, but if they're really honest with themselves, there's a bit of an anger that's inside of them that boils and simmers just a little bit below the surface. Because lots of people take advantage of those who are meek. It's hard for those who are meek to really grab the bull by the horns and take what's rightfully theirs. That's just not the way that they see the world. And then the question, right? The question is, who will inherit the earth? Who inherits the earth? We're going to chop it up. We're going to divide it up. Who gets it? And in the first century, that answer is really clear. Who inherits the earth? Rome inherits the earth in the first century. Many people around the world today, if you were to say who inherits the earth, they would say the United States inherits the earth, or China inherits the earth. Some of the greatest empires, superpowers that have ever existed in the history of human civilization. Who inherits the earth? Well, it's the people with the most gusto, the people with the most autonomy, the people with the largest armies, the people who will just take it. That's who inherits the earth. And for those of us who are meek or mild, who often get overlooked, the wallflowers in the corners who have big ideas but who struggle to speak them into existence. Jesus reminds you that every inch of the cosmos belongs to God, and if you are one of his children, it is your inheritance as well. You get it all. Who inherits the earth? Not Rome. Rome doesn't exist anymore. Bad news for us, by the way, not the United States. We won't exist forever either. Who inherits the earth? Those who follow after God. If you are meek, the world doesn't realize it yet, but you get the earth. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Perhaps you're the kind of person that when you see a wrong, like you just absolutely can't go along with it. Perhaps you're the kind of person who's paid a price for that. Like you've been a whistleblower at your job or at your school. You've been the person that has to tattletale when something goes wrong because like you're like, no, that's just not right. I can't live with that. That is also like, it's not just a personality, it's also a moral disposition. And while there are whistleblower laws in place for people who go against the grain, who refuse to just go along with it, like the recognition is like beyond just maybe keeping a job, like there are consequences for hungering and thirsting for righteousness. Like people often don't like you so much if you're the one that says like, no, that's not right, we can't do that. Like there are relational costs to that. And Jesus says like, if that's you, if that's been the way that you've lived your life, if you found yourself in situations where you were the one who couldn't go along with something, you will be filled. It may feel like you have emptied yourself out on behalf of others right now, but there will come a time where you are filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Let's just be honest about the merciful. Oftentimes people take advantage of the merciful in different ways than they do the meek. A friend of mine, his grandparents owned a clothing store during the Great Depression. And so when lots of the townspeople couldn't afford clothes, they allowed people to buy clothes from their clothing store on credit. And those people ended up never being able to pay them back. It was just a horrible, abysmal financial period of time in that particular town, and for lots of towns like it, all across the United States. They ended up losing their business, and they ended up being poor basically into their old age because they chose to be merciful. And yet, even those who show mercy and sometimes get taken advantage of it, like sometimes that sticks with you and has consequences for you long, long, long till the end of your life even. And many people who choose to show mercy, even if it costs them something, maybe especially if it costs them something, decide that it was worth it anyway. And Jesus says, for those of you who have a natural disposition toward mercy, it's baked into your DNA. It's who you are. Please know that your mercy is not in vain. The mercy you show to others will be shown to you because we serve a merciful God. Mercy, by the way, has nothing to do with merit. Mercy is just grace. It can't be earned. Earned mercy is just compensation. Mercy is something you don't You don't earn. God is not going to be merciful to the merciful because they're merciful. God's going to be merciful to the merciful because he's just that kind of God. Blessed are you who are merciful, for you will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. The pure in heart seems to be another way of talking about the perfectionists among us, okay? Pure in heart is almost a sarcastic thing to call you. I'm sorry. It just means that there is a perfection that you are always chasing and probably never attaining. Perfectionists are often harder on themselves than they are on other people. They expect the best out of themselves, and therefore they expect the best out of you. Perfectionists often make enemies at work because people can never quite live up to the standards of the perfectionists. True perfectionists, even at dinner, right? These are the people who will send the same steak back several times to make sure that it's just perfect. It's never quite right. My dad used to go to dinner sometimes with a friend of his named Jimmy Kelly, who passed away some years ago. Jimmy Kelly was a perfectionist. He was a music producer. So he owned a recording studio, and he was a brilliant producer, and he was a perfectionist, the exact kind of person you want to produce your album, right? He was just keep going and keep going. But he's not the kind of person you want to eat dinner with. He expected the waiter or the waitress to be perfect as well. So when he would sit down, he expected his glass to never get on empty. And so if his tea ever ran out, instead of waiting for the waiter or waitress to come by and say, like, could I have some more tea? He would just get a spoon and start binging the side of his glass and just go, tea, 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 tea. And of course, they just thought he was having a stroke. He was a perfectionist. And some of you know the burden of being a perfectionist, even if you've learned to adjust it socially so that people don't hate you and spit in your face. You feel it inside. And Jesus is saying, for those of you who are pure in heart, for those of you who are perfectionists, there will come a day when you are face to face with God and you will finally discover the perfection your heart has been searching for your entire life. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. By the way, being a peacemaker, not easy. If you're trying to walk in amongst two parties who have a disagreement, you're trying to make peace, the result is neither of them like you. I have a friend named Jeff Patrick. He was a beat cop for years, a police officer before he started working for security in a bank. And he would always tell me two things. He'd just come up a lot. First of all, he would always rather have an encounter with someone who's high on marijuana than someone who's drinking alcohol. He brought that up a lot. Made me wonder if he smoked marijuana a lot. The second thing he always said was that his least favorite call was coming in and settling family disputes. Like when you had potentially a violent conflict or a shouting conflict, because you'd walk in and he was like, you'd always assume that probably the male was the physical aggressor, but that wasn't always the case. And then you didn't really know what started it, because a lot of times these relationships have gotten so toxic that both of them know exactly what buttons to press, and one may set the other one off, and the other one may overreact and do something really stupid, but you find out but there was a lot of manipulation over here. Is you'd walk in and you would try to make peace here, and what you'd find out is that both these people hated you by the end of it, and it was really hard to solve. For those of you who make peace as part of your job, as part of your living, or as part of just your natural personality and disposition, you take crap all the time. Blessed are you, because God is the ultimate peacemaker. And when you step in with your natural personality or with your job and you make peace, it's like you're a child of God, because he's the ultimate peacemaker. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of God. If you've been pursuing righteousness, if that's part of who you are, and you face persecution for that, God says, you get the kingdom of heaven. You get the kingdom of heaven, not in some future way, but if you are pursuing righteousness in the name of Jesus now, if that's the way that you are living your life, if you find yourself in that particular situation, you need to know that heaven doesn't have to wait until after you die. It's not just an eternity thing. You bring heaven here now. You participate, you own, you drive down the kingdom of heaven now, and in doing so, you are blessed. God is on your side. God is with you. Finally, Jesus says, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Again, this is an announcement, not a commandment. Jesus isn't saying if you aren't being persecuted for your faith, you need to go get persecuted. You need to go down to Huntington Beach and start telling people on the pier that they're going to hell and see if they'll get mad at you, right? Then you'll be persecuted. That's not being persecuted. That's being a jerk, okay? There's a difference. So Jesus isn't telling you to try to get in kerfuffles or try to get people all upset with you. In fact, that Paul says the exact opposite, right? Insofar as it's up to you, live in peace with the people around you. Live a quiet life. Follow after God and show them with the love that you have for them and for the world around you that this is real, that these blessings really exist. But if you find yourself persecuted, because in the first century they certainly did, and honestly, a number of you will find yourself facing some kind of social stigma or some kind of persecution in this life for the faith in Jesus that you have if it's real for you. Jesus says when that happens, you are blessed as well. It won't happen for all of us, but for some it will. And when you are blessed, rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. In the same way, they persecuted the prophets who were before you. In other words, like you're not the first. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. And God blesses those who find themselves persecuted for his sake. What Jesus is really doing here in all of these announcements is letting us know that the kingdom of God is at hand, that the whole world is different and shaken up now because of what God is doing now. It's not happening later, it's happening now. And he's letting people know that all the ways that they've thought about who is living the best life actually aren't valid. It's not just the wealthy and the powerful and the religious authorities who get to live a good life now. They're not just living the good life. It's not just those people then who have control. In fact, what Jesus is saying is like if you find yourself as a spiritual zero, as someone who feels distant from God, as someone who is meek and mild, as someone who's being taken advantage of, as someone who's been merciful, a person of peace, a person who is persecuted for the sake of God. If you find yourself in any of these places, you need to know that regardless of how it feels, you are blessed because God is on your side. This is not an exclusive religion. Jesus is trying to open it up for everyone. If you want the kingdom of heaven, it's yours. Luxury brands thrive because of scarcity. Versace, Gucci, Louis Vuitton, Ferrari, like there isn't a lot of that stuff out in the public. Now, in Southern California, there's more of it, but there's not a lot of that stuff out in the public, right? The reason that people pay high dollar is usually because A, it's fairly well made, and then B, it's scarce. It costs a lot of money. It keeps the availability of it down, and therefore when you own it, when you possess it, it makes you feel special, unique. Not everybody can have this. I have it, but not everybody else can have it. And that just feels kind of good. Jesus is taking this religious tradition. These religious traditions in the first century were incredibly exclusive. Like the Jewish religion was supposed to be to bless the whole world, but in fact, by the time we got to the first century, it was mostly a minority religion against a small ethnic group in the Empire of Rome. And you could technically be a part of some of what they were doing. If you were a Gentile, you'd be called a God-fearer, and you could come into the temple and worship in the outer courts. But you were limited as to your participation, and part of the draw was the exclusivity. Ubiquity is the death of luxury. When it's everywhere, it doesn't feel as luxurious, and ubiquity was the death of these religions in the first century. When it feels like everybody has access to it, then it doesn't feel as special anymore. In fact, by the end of the first century and heading into the second century, there was another religious tradition that came on the scene called Gnosticism. And this was all about having secret knowledge or secret information or finding out about a mystery, and you had to join in order to get what the mystery was. So it felt very, it's very, very insidery is what it felt like. Jesus is taking this Jewish religion that was very exclusive to people literally with a blood relationship to other people who are in it, and he is opening it way up. He's taking Versace and he's making it available to Walmart. So people didn't love that. In fact, the scribes and the Pharisees didn't love that. When you start to read through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you see who's the most upset, it's the scribes and the Pharisees. The Pharisees were some of the greatest religious leaders of their day within the Jewish tradition, and the scribes were like lawyers in the first century who were very intimate with the law of God from the Old Testament, from like the book of Deuteronomy, Leviticus, And so they would help with coming up with marriage contracts, divorce contracts. They would take their intimate knowledge of the law and they would apply it to religious life. And Jesus is here to tear down the whole system, which puts them out of work. In fact, a major reason that Jesus is killed. Jesus is killed in part because he's making God too accessible. This was a radical message in the first century, and frankly, it's a radical message now. So if you want to be a part of some VIP designer religion, Christianity isn't that. If you want some kind of exclusive privilege and access to God that other people don't get at, that's not what Christianity is about. But if you want to be a part of something that is for everyone, if you want to be a part of something that is for those who are, yes, wealthy in society and those who do well, like, yeah, the kingdom of heaven can be theirs as well, but those who are spiritually poor, those who are meek and mild, those who are the peacemakers, those who get taken advantage of, those who feel distant from God, the spiritual zeros, the dregs of society, the poorest of the poor. If you want to be a part of that, something that's all-encompassing, and it's not just exclusive, but it's the good news of God for everyone who wants it, then Walmart is our store. We shop there because we're poor. Lower prices every day. That's why we shop the Walmart way. Boy, you'll clap for anything, won't you? I don't know your story. Some of you I do. But I do know this. No matter where you've come from, what you've been through, or where you are, if you want it, the kingdom of heaven is yours. Which is why Christianity can never become tribalistic, can never become exclusive, and can never be an us versus everyone else, because that goes directly against the teachings of our founder. The whole world can be blessed because God chooses to bless the whole world. It's an upside down way of thinking about things. It was radical 2,000 years ago. Guess what? It's radical now. Father, thanks for the invitation to everyone. Thank you that we're not just a part of some exclusive VIP movement, but Lord, like you have thrown the doors wide open. And you've said regardless of bloodline, regardless of past, present, or regardless of our disposition, our personalities, how poor or wealthy or powerless or powerful, the kingdom of heaven is for us. And Lord, I'm just, it's so beautiful that it's not human. It's divine. And so I pray, God, that for those of us who feel far from you or distant from you, Lord, that we would receive your invitation to just step into the reality that you have for us, this inheritance. It's rich inheritance of your kingdom. And I pray, God, that as we do, Lord, that our lives will be transformed and changed to look more like Jesus, not because you commanded it, but because you blessed us. And that transformation caused us to live a different way. And I pray then that we would be a blessing to others around us. May we be a force of good for the world, not for our sake, Lord, but for yours. Because the world that you so dearly love desperately needs to receive your blessings, Lord, and we are carriers of your blessings. It's in Jesus' name I pray.